Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're going to go over PCAOB issues. They issued a new standard and the amendments related to working with a specialist. So before we get started, I just want to make sure we can go over a few housekeeping items. Just so you know, you can maximize or minimize the webinar pane during the presentation using the red and orange arrow buttons. And during the webinar, we definitely encourage you to ask questions in the webinar pane. You can see a questions box, so definitely type those in and our presenters will answer those as time allows during the presentation. And I want to make sure everyone has good audio. So if you are using your telephone, make sure you select the phone call audio option. And if you're on your computer, make sure you select the computer audio option. And then just as a reminder, we are on social media. So make sure you're following us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. That way you don't miss anything. And then I do want to make sure we can introduce our presenters. So today we have Ricardo, who has more than 20 years of accounting experience, including 12 years at the Big Four. He works closely with CFOs, controllers, and audit committees for both public and fast-growing private companies in the technology and life science industries. And we also have Dean, that after spending 12 years as an auditor, he transitioned to be our chief relationship builder. He helps numerous private, public, and nonprofit companies address their tax, audit, and outsourcing needs. So take it away, guys.
Awesome. Ricardo, I got to say, 20 years in, no gray hair. You lucky duck.
I know. I don't know what I'm doing.
I got no hair. You have no gray hair. That is not fair. That is not fair. All right. Well, we'll hop to it. Anytime there's a new PCAOB auditing standard, we want to be all over it and help our clients and everybody out in our network. So with regards to this one, auditing accounting estimates and use of a specialist, today we'll figure out, or we'll kind of go through the standard and we'll say who is considered a specialist, when using a company specialist, or maybe it's an auditor specialist, how these changes will impact the audit process, and some important dates. We do know that this seems to be a focus by the PCAOB, so we definitely want everyone to be ahead of the curve here.
Yeah, and so as we kind of get on to the next couple of slides here, just a couple of things that we want to do for the group is obviously for the auditors that are in the room to talk about what the impact is on the audit process, but then also for companies as well who might be listening in to also discuss what the impact will be for them, as well as there be probably some incremental effort and documents that are needed and required by the auditors in order to get the work done and comply with the standards, which means some extra time that might be added to the process that should be taken into account. So one of the things that we want to just talk about is just kind of a little bit of background on these two standards that just recently came out at the end of December, and it was actually issued right after the AICPA SEC PCAOB conference that's held in Washington, D.C. And typically the PCAOB uses that as an opportunity to identify areas of improvement and discuss the different rules and regulations that'll be coming out or coming down the pipeline. And so this is one of the areas that has been of heightened focus to the PCAOB through their inspection process. And so here what we want to talk about or first focus on is just who is a specialist, and essentially a specialist is a person or firm possessing just skills or knowledge in a particular field other than accounting or auditing. And some of the examples that are frequently mentioned by the PCAOB include actuaries, appraisers, valuation specialists, legal specialists, and environmental engineers. And what the PCAOB has been kind of focused on is just proper supervision and oversight of the specialist work by the auditor. And there's really been heightened risk around the auditor's work in terms of the sufficiency in being able to detect material misstatements in those accounting estimates. And what the PCAOB noticed is that there was diversity in practice regarding the use of the work of a specialist. And what the PCAOB does typically is as they're doing inspections, they really separate it between larger firms and smaller firms, larger firms being those that audit over 100 public entities annually, and smaller firms being those that are under the 100 company marker. And so they've noticed that there's diversity in practice even within the large firms, but also with the smaller firms. And so what they tried to do is create a standard that really addresses a lot of the diversity in practice and try to bring some consistency in how auditors are approaching and analyzing and evaluating the use of a specialist. And what they've done is they've updated Appendix A in the auditing standard 1105, which didn't apply when the auditor used the work of a person with a specialized skill or knowledge in certain areas. And the appendix updated just different areas that are a focus, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides here. One of the things that I do want to draw note to is, while we have the examples up there of the PCAOB focus areas, the standard doesn't apply when the auditor uses the work of an income tax specialist or an IT specialist as part of their audit evidence. It also doesn't apply when information is provided by a company's attorney concerning litigations, claims, and assessments that's used by the auditor pursuant to auditing standard 2505. But if the company uses, or excuse me, if the auditor uses the work of a company's attorney as audit evidence in other matters relating to some sort of legal expertise, for example, if there's a legal interpretation on a contractual provision or a legal opinion regarding isolation of, let's say, transferred financial assets, then the standard would apply. So just keeping that in mind when we come to the areas of focus for the standard regarding the specialist. So on this slide, we'll notice that when you would actually use a company specialist, and the standard supplements the requirements in auditing standard 1105, the auditor's using the work of a company specialist as audit evidence. It also aligns the requirements for using the work of the company specialist, really focusing on the risk assessment standards and identifying those areas that are of highest risk and focusing on those areas. What the PCAOB noticed is that through the inspection process, there was a focus on maybe estimates that, or excuse me, specialists were focusing on areas that really didn't have a large risk of material misstatement, which really didn't provide value to the audit. And so thankfully they recognized that and then made changes so that the focus more aligns with the risk assessment standards. And then in terms of determining the evidence that's needed to support a conclusion around a relevant assertion was another focus area for the standard and updating it. All right, so contrary to that, so, I think you've kind of noticed from the prior slide, it's when the company uses their own specialist, and now what we're focusing on is when the auditor uses their own specialist. And some of the differences too as well, in that the standard now requires more of a supervisory approach for assessing skills, knowledge, and ability of an audit engaged specialist. So in other words, just making sure that some due diligence is done by the auditor in order to ensure that the specialist that's being used has the necessary skills, knowledge, and expertise in order to perform the analysis.
And Ricardo, is this when it's someone on the auditor's team, or is it someone that the auditor might engage?
It could be either. It could be either on the auditor's team, or it could be on the auditor engaged specialist. So it's definitely a good point. Making sure that either group actually has the necessary skills, knowledge, and ability in order to perform a review of a particular area. From an objectivity perspective, there's also a focus on an ability to exercise impartial judgment on all issues related to the audit. So ensuring that there isn't any sort of a prior relationship that might impact impartiality on the specialist's judgment is also another focus area for the team. And then lastly, just kind of specifying the auditor's obligation if the specialist does have a relationship with the company that might affect that objectivity. So a couple of other things too, just to highlight on this slide and the prior slide, again, is just there's a new Appendix A in the auditing standard, which will really help auditors obtain, or focus auditors on obtaining an understanding of the work and the reports and the related company processes and controls. And again, there's been greater focus by the PCAOB on the control environment and internal control over financial reporting, particularly from management's perspective. So if there is a specialist that's involved in a particular area, and obviously this has ties directly into estimates typically, as we talked about some of the examples prior, there is a focus on management to really have good processes and controls around those particular areas where there are estimates, or where they might use a company specialist in order to ensure that they monitor and manage those processes and have controls in place to identify any sort of risk of material misstatement. There's also a focus on obtaining an understanding of and assessing, again, the knowledge of company and certainly auditor specialists as well. As part of this project, as we note on this slide here, the board did amend auditing standard 1201, which is supervision of the audit engagement, and it really supplements the requirements for applying kind of the supervisory principles in that auditing standard when you have an auditor employed specialist, really directing that individual as to how the work is to be performed, coordinating the work with other engagement team members, and then certainly reviewing and evaluating the work of that auditor employed specialist to make sure that the audit evidence is sufficient and appropriate. And then lastly, as part of the overall standard, the PCAOB did amend AS 1210, and they amended it by establishing additional requirements for using the work of the specialist in obtaining and evaluating the evidence, reaching an understanding of the work to be performed, and then obviously reviewing it, setting forth factors necessary for the extent of the review, and then amending the requirements again regarding the skills, knowledge, and experience of that specialist, and then again just discussing objectivity. So overall, really what this means is that there's additional oversight that's required by the auditor in terms of directing the specialist and then evaluating the results of those. So from the auditor's perspective, there's going to be additional scrutiny, I think, around this particular area and how the auditor has focused attention. I think also from management side, there's going to be additional scrutiny by the auditor in terms of the processes and controls that are in place that management has. So there's going to be some incremental work if documentation hasn't been developed around these types of areas. So from management's perspective, they'll need to make sure that they're preparing adequate documentation or reviewing existing documentation, processes, and controls to see if there's anything else that kind of needs to change. Again, some of the activities where the work of a specialist might be involved, like we said, on the valuation side, goodwill impairment, insurance reserves, intangible assets, pensions and other employment obligations. For legal interpretations, maybe legal title to property, laws, regulations, contracts, and then so some other areas that might be a focus would be oil and gas reserves, mineral reserves, property, plant, and equipment, useful lives, and salvage lives. So certainly, I think there's a broad range of areas that are affected by the work of a specialist, whether it's company or auditor specialist, and definitely an area of focus that should be had by both management of the organization as well as the auditor. Okay, so we're going to shift over now to kind of a similarly affected auditing standard, and these two were kind of released at the same time because they really work off one another. So when you're thinking about auditing accounting estimates, typically these are high risk areas that are that typically either the company or an auditor will use a specialist in order to evaluate the accuracy of that estimate. And so that's why, for the most part, these do kind of go in tandem together. So when we think about one, especially if you think about estimates, in a lot of cases, there might be a specialist involved, which means that we're looking at the prior auditing standard for support and how to analyze these estimates. So essentially what happened is the PCAOB replaced 3 existing standards with a single standard. And the objective was really to build upon some of those approaches in the existing standards, providing more direction to auditors as they saw diversity in practice, extending certain fair value measurement requirements to other estimates, increased focus on estimates with greater risk of material misstatement. So again, just really trying to hone in on aligning kind of the risk-based standards with the estimates that are involved. One of the things that they noticed through the inspection process was that auditors were really treating all estimates almost equally when they weren't really focusing on those that had a greater risk of material misstatement, which really detracted then from the focus on those higher risk estimates. So they wanted to align the standards to provide more clarity and help out the auditors. That means for a company, and from your perspective, management, there might be a shift in focus by the auditors on those estimates with a greater risk of material misstatement, which means there might be hours shifted from maybe one area to another in terms of what they're actually focusing on, shifting focus to those higher risk areas to ensure that they're complying with the new standard. Some of the accounting estimate examples include certainly the revenues from contracts with customers under ASC 606, valuation of financial and non-financial assets, impairment of long-lived assets, allowance for credit losses, and then contingent liability. So if you look at this example, this really ties back to the use of the specialist standard that we just discussed and where a specialist might be involved. So you'll see some synergies between the two in terms of what we're focusing on as auditors, but also how that might be impacted by the use of the specialist.
Are they saying, Ricardo, that the auditors could consider using a specialist, especially in areas like this?
Yeah, so that could be a byproduct too, from a cost benefit perspective that the PCAOB did acknowledge, is that by increasing focus on accounting estimates around those higher risk areas, there might be the need for a specialist to be involved, whether it's a company specialist or whether it's an auditor specialist that's utilized in the process. So that is something to consider, and obviously to work with. If you're on management side, work with your auditors now to try to figure out, with these change in the auditing standards, what is that going to mean from a focus point for the auditors? Is there going to be a need or requirement to engage potentially a specialist, either by the company or by the auditor? And what will that impact mean to the organization as well? If you're an auditor, certainly consider having dialogue with management about these topics now. We'll get to the effective date shortly of these two standards, so there is a little bit of time, but engage with management now to discuss what the impact might be on the audit process, so all parties can really plan for it. And certainly the auditor should discuss these changes with the audit committee as well. Okay, so what are some of the changes that are involved in the process? So the new standard and kind of the related amendments really changed the requirement among the engagement team to engage in more dialogue regarding management bias and how management bias might impact the risk of material misstatement related to the estimate, emphasizing greater focus on professional skepticism, identifying the assumptions that are utilized in order to arrive at the estimate, or the assumptions that are used in order to determine what that estimate is, requiring the auditor to obtain an understanding of management's analysis. So again, this kind of ties back to the processes and controls that are in place around the estimate. What the PCAOB found is that in some cases, certain companies were better at identifying the processes and controls as were, the auditors in terms of then testing those controls and around those particular areas. So requiring the auditors just to ensure that that actually occurs. So if there is a significant estimate with a high risk of material misstatement, and the company doesn't have good documentation around or how that estimate is derived, then that'll be something that management needs to pull together and might take some time. If there's processes and controls that need to be put in place around those particular estimates, then that's something that needs to be discussed now with management in order to identify where those gaps are. And certainly underlying all of this is just communication with the audit committee around these changes as well. Again, integration with the risk assessment standard. So again, not necessarily providing equal weight to all estimates, but really greater focus on those areas where there is a higher risk of material misstatement. And then they've provided specific examples for auditing the fair value of financial instruments as well, which has been a focus area for the PCAOB. All of this really stems from, I guess most of the changes stem from PCAOB inspections where they really saw deficiencies or failures related to the auditor's ability to sufficiently test the accuracy and completeness of the data that's used in fair value measurements or other estimates, evaluating reasonableness of assumptions, understanding third-party pricing sources. In the case of audits of broker-dealers, failures related to an inability to obtain an understanding of the methods and assumptions used by third parties, and performing really sufficient work to test valuation of securities. From enforcement cases, the PCAOB did note that a lot of the enforcement cases related to auditors' inability or failure to perform any procedures to determine the reasonableness of significant assumptions, failure to test relevance, sufficiency, and reliability of the data supporting the estimate, failures to perform retrospective review, and then a failure to adequately consider contradictory evidence. So this is typically how the PCAOB would arrive at these types of amendments to the auditing standards, is by looking at inspection results, both for large firms, small firms, consulting with, providing concept releases, and then soliciting feedback. And so this is how they all kind of arrived at the changes to the auditing standard. So what's the impact to the audit process? So that's probably the biggest part that everybody kind of wants to know. We touched about those a little bit.
That's what I'm thinking.
From a specialist perspective, certainly expect increased oversight, coordination, and supervision from the auditor. Expect greater scrutiny of contradictory evidence. So having a dialogue about that, being able to explain where those inconsistencies might arise and how those arise, and providing support for the ultimate conclusion that's been reached. Additional analysis of methods and assumptions, greater focus on testing completeness and accuracy of the source data. If for whatever reason there's some sort of involvement of a SOC report, there may be greater focus on that SOC report by the auditor. And also, if I'm thinking about it all the way through, end user considerations on SOC reports need to be tested by management, and could possibly be tested by the auditor as well if it affects one of these particular areas. Heightened evaluation of professional qualifications. So if those haven't been had before, or maybe they've been presumed to have occurred, now there'll actually be some active dialogue around this, as well as discussions and requests for professional qualifications, skills, knowledge, ability of the specialist. With regards to estimates, additional testing of the source data, increased examination of the assumptions, greater focus on any information that's provided by third-party resources, and then certainly a focus on retrospective review. So all of that is really going to impact, the auditor certainly, but also management in terms of additional information that they might need to be required to provide to the auditors as part of this change in the process.
So Ricardo, if there, I just heard increased validation. Like just because you have a specialist doesn't mean that you're okay. You need to, that specialist then needs to just go ahead and extra validate why they believe what they believe.
Right, exactly. And there's going to be greater focus on that. And a lot of that had presumed to had been taking place, but through the inspection process, PCAOB kind of noticed that that wasn't taking place. And so now they want to make that as explicit as possible, driving consistency in the process. So expect greater scrutiny in those areas. From a date perspective, certainly these are pending auditing standards, but more likely than not, these are going to be approved by the SEC. These amendments will take place for audits of financial statements, fiscal years beginning on or ending after December 15th, 2020. So again, there's a little bit of time, but certainly something that you want to have active dialogue if you're the auditor with management, if you're management with the auditor. And then again, underlying all of this, both groups need to have good proactive communication with the audit committee in order to ensure that everybody's planning for this. A couple of other areas that will be impacted by this once this actually takes place is critical audit matters. So, another important topic or focus area for public companies is the critical audit matters, which will be coming down the pipeline in a few years for the audit opinion, where auditors are going to be required to identify those critical audit matters. There is some, these areas, especially regarding estimates and the use of specialists, are potential areas that might be included as part of those critical audit matter paragraphs in the audit opinion. So again, it makes sense for auditors, audit committees, and management all to get together, get on the same page, and start planning for these types of changes, because not only will there be an impact to the audit process, there could possibly be an impact to the audit opinion and how it's affected. So we kind of talked about that, really just dialogue. I mean, dialogue is the biggest thing right now between auditors, management, and audit committee. The PCAOB and SEC certainly encourage those active dialogues to identify those changes that are coming down the pipeline, as well as to identify gaps and how to address those gaps and work collectively as a group to ensure that management has the right processes and controls in place to address any sort of changes that are coming down the pipeline, particularly with regards to these types of topic areas. All right, so I think we have a few minutes for questions.
We 1 minute for questions if any come in. But Ricardo, it just seems as we kind of just wrap this up, it just seems that be prepared for a deeper dive, right? Anywhere there's a specialist, where we feel like in the past, hey, that was okay because we had a specialist. Basically, the PCAOB is saying, hey, it's great that they have a specialist. Now you need to really kind of, really probe that specialist, is what I'm hearing.
Right. That's exactly right. And for those that are from a company perspective that are participating on this webinar, definitely a greater focus area by auditors, definitely a greater focus area by the PCAOB. I think it's this year they were actually mentioning, the PCAOB is mentioning as part of the inspection process, they plan on speaking with audit committee chairs of those that are being selected, or potentially having the ability to meet and have dialogue with the audit committee chairs once the inspection or the company is selected for inspection by the PCAOB. They didn't really say much else in terms of what that actually means and what sort of conversations that they might have, but this is certainly an area that they would want to be prepared for and see what sort of dialogue auditors are having with management and the audit committee regarding the changes that are coming down the pipeline. Yeah, so the question around kind of IT specialists, this doesn't cover, these standards don't cover the use of any sort of IT audit related specialist, or when IT specialists are used as part of the audit evidence. Those are actually scoped out of this. So it's really just relates to a lot of those areas that I kind of described before, which would be, you know, actuaries, appraisers, any sort of other valuation specialists, legal specialists, environmental engineers, that type of stuff. All right. Well, thank you guys. We appreciate you participating on this. And anything else I missed?
Nope, we're good to go. Everyone will receive an email where you can then download the presentation and the recording within the next 48 hours. So definitely take a look. Thank you.
Thanks.